Hey everybody. Today we're going to do one of our last lectures for the water soluble vitamins. We're going to be covering both folate and B12. And I put those two in the same lecture because you'll see that their kind of function and metabolism and everything is super interrelated. So, what happened to the missing B vitamins? I kind of promised that I'd go over why the numbering for all the B vitamins are kind of weird. You probably noticed that there's like one, two, three, then it skips to five, six, and then it turns out that biotin is actually B7 if you're interested, but I never hear it referred to as that. We'll do biotin next week. The TA will be teaching that, and that will be the last lecture for water soluble vitamins. Folate is B9 if you're interested, but again, I rarely hear people say B9. And then the last one that was ever discovered is B12. So, and that was discovered in 1948. So, yeah, about 70 years ago. I think what happened was in kind of the early 1900s when they started discovering the vitamins, there was just this like crazy rush in nutrition sciences to like be the first one to discover whatever new vitamin there was. So people were just kind of going crazy and they like just labeled anything as a vitamin right away without even realizing, like without doing a full body of research on it and seeing if it was actually essential or not. So a lot of these things were discovered and they're definitely very important to the body. But later on, even like a few months later or something, it was discovered that we can actually make that. So, and if we can make it, then it's not an essential vitamin. So the first one we talked about was actually last lecture. That was B4, which was adenine. And remember, that's the one in like DNA and RNA. So super important, but we can definitely make it. B8 was something called inositol, which our bodies make. It's important for growth. So yeah, again, not essential, not considered a vitamin. B9 is folate, and then B10 is para-aminobenzoic acid or PABA. Some of you may have heard of this before. In the 80s and 90s, they used to put it in sunscreen. I'm not sure if you remember when you were younger that, yeah, it was basically all the sunscreen was labeled like PABA or PABA free. It turns out a lot of people were really allergic to it. So yeah, that's one thing. It is actually a component of folate, which we'll see in a second. So it does have an essential role in the body, but our body can make PABA in particular. So this one component of folate. And then B11 is choline. And there's some debate whether or not that should be added to the B vitamins. There's an AI set for it. It's important for kind of integrity and signaling of cell membranes. You can find it kind of in like liver and egg yolks as a food source. So it's in the DRI books, but in talking to nutritionists, some people consider it essential and some people don't. There's kind of this debate over it at this point. And then, yeah, last one was B12 that was discovered in 1948. And then after that, I don't know if people just stopped studying this, if other things came along or what happened, but basically, there hasn't been any vitamins discovered until past that. And, I think we're foolish to think that we have discovered all the things that are essential to our body. There's probably like a whole other component of things. Who knows, like not vitamins or minerals, but just some other food component that we don't even know about yet that's playing a super important role in our body. But yeah, it's yet to be discovered basically. So folic acid, I have to say, is kind of complicated. But pretty much everything about it, like what it does, I'd say is probably one of the most difficult functions to understand for a vitamin. The structure of it is also a little bit complicated. I'll try to repeat myself in this a lot because I get a lot of questions about this kind of after this lecture. But yeah, let me just start off very basically by saying that the weird part about it is that folic acid relates to the supplement form, or it's used to describe the form found in supplements. So it's the oxidized form of folate. So folic acid, oxidized form found in supplements and then in fortified foods too. So any kind of like additional supplement you're adding to a food. Folate, on the other hand, is considered something totally different. It's a reduced form of the vitamin, and that's the form that's found naturally in foods. So it's confusing because, I've told you before that the folate and the ic acid of anything are just kind of synonymous. It's just two different ways of saying the same thing. But in the case of folate, they represent two different things. So folic acid is the supplement form, basically. Folate is the natural food form. And this is what folate looks like. So it consists of three different things. A pteridine, so this guy right here, a PABA, what we just discussed on the previous slide, and then a glutamate or a glutamic acid. So it's made up of these three distinct parts, and all of them have to be present and attached to each other for the vitamin to actually be active. And then here I just mentioned too that PABA, this was that thing I was saying that was in sunscreen. And for the life of me, I can't find out why they actually put it in sunscreen. I'm not sure. I don't think it actually helped with the sunscreen part of it, but it was in those creams. And tons of people developed these weird, like allergic reactions to it. So they took it out. So the weird thing about folate is that our bodies can actually make each of these things. So we can make pteridine, PABA, and glutamic acid, but we just don't have that enzyme that joins these two things. So we can't join pteridine or pteridine, not quite sure how to say it, to PABA. So we don't have the enzyme to join this. So that's why folate is essential to us, just because we can't kind of connect those two things. And so that's why we need to get folate from foods or supplements. One thing that starts to confuse people right off the bat is this glutamate situation. So folate always has this one glutamate here, but then several other glutamates can be attached. And this is not the coenzyme form, though. That's what confuses people. So it always has one glutamate, and that's the monoglutamate form. You can attach up to 9 more glutamates, so making it into the polyglutamate form when there's 2 to 9 glutamates. And the glutamates, again, not the coenzyme form, but what it does is it actually helps the folate kind of join better to the enzyme. It kind of makes it a better coenzyme. So it has kind of higher bioavailability, can basically kind of stick to the enzyme a little bit better. So it just kind of helps do its job, but it is not the coenzyme form. I'll show you the coenzyme forms, of which there are 3 major ones. We'll get to that slide. But yeah, glutamate just helps it stick to its enzyme better. So the more you have, the more glutamates, the more it's going to be attracted to that enzyme, and then it will act as a better coenzyme once it's in its coenzyme form. Food sources of folate doesn't really follow the meats and grains thing, unfortunately. Folate has pretty specific food sources, so dark green leafy vegetables like beans, fruits, that type of thing. A lot of like fruits and vegetables primarily. That's where you mainly get it. So not a ton or barely anything in like meats or anything like that. They do fortify cereal with a lot of folate. So usually just one serving of cereal will give you about 75% of your folate needs. And then also, if you're interested, or if you want to put it here, the RDAs for folate is 400 for men and 400 for women. And just to note that these are in micrograms now. So they're needed in much smaller quantities than the previous B vitamins we were looking at. And then the reason that they started adding such kind of large quantities was all because of neural tube defects, which you may know about, and you may know that it's related to folate. If you're a woman who's had a baby, you probably definitely know about folate at this point and how it's related. But if you don't, let me just give you a bit of background. So initially what happened was they noticed this link between low folate levels and neural tube defects. So women that did not or were not taking in enough folate their babies develop neural tube defects. And I'll go over that in detail in the deficiency slides. And so when they noticed this, they said, well, we know folate's found in fruits and vegetables, so why don't we do this big public health effort to have people increase their fruits and vegetables? And as people in nutrition and the dietetics field, you're probably learning pretty quickly that it's really hard for people to change their diets. It's definitely really hard for them to increase fruits and vegetables. There was that whole, I think it's still going on, like the public health effort for like 5 a day, which is like just 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. And, that kind of failed as well. And if you look at like NHANES data, that kind of shows you what people are eating. I think the main things that people are eating in terms of fruits and vegetables are tomatoes as ketchup and pizza sauce. And then like French fries, I think also count. Like it's kind of a sad situation, but definitely we're not consuming enough raw fruits and vegetables as we should be. So yeah, so telling people to eat more fruits and vegetables generally doesn't work for a whole host of reasons, but a major reason is access to. They're expensive and a lot of people can't afford them. So then they noticed that. So they were like, okay, something that might be a little better or just a bit more straightforward for everyone is if we just fortify folate. So if we add kind of high amounts of it to flours, grains, and cereals. So starting in the late 90s, they started adding 140 micrograms of folic acid per 100 grams of products. So you'll notice, the other B vitamins, a lot of them are fortified in cereals, is like 20-30% or so of what you need per day per serving of cereal. But folate, it's usually hovering around like 75-80% of what you need in just one serving of a grain product. So, and again, that's all related to trying to decrease neural tube defects in infants. So the bioavailability of folate is also a little complicated. It really varies from person to person. So some people will be absorbing like 98% or almost 100% of the folate that they take in from foods or supplements, whereas other people will be doing like just absorbing like just 10%, so much smaller amounts. And this is all related to different individual things like genetics, so the pH of your stomach, the amount of enzymes you have available for digestion, which is also related to your age. The food matrix, they found that folate present, there's a bit of folate in milk, that actually helps. There's something in milk that increases absorption. If you tend to boil vegetables, fruits, that type of thing, you can lose a lot of it into the water. So if you're not recouping the water, you can, if that's your main source of vegetable intake, kind of boiled vegetables, then you're pretty much losing most of that unless you're reusing that water. So different things that lead to people just not getting enough or not absorbing enough. There's also something called dietary folate equivalents, and these are used in the DRIs. I do have another slide kind of down the line when we get to the DRIs, but very basically what they've noticed is that the bioavailability or someone's ability to absorb folate differs between foods and supplements. So when you get it from a supplement, you actually absorb 100% of that. So you take in the supplement and most of that, well, depending on your body, how much it can absorb, but the supplement itself, you can absorb 100% of it. And then from food sources, for some reason, the body doesn't have access to all of it, and it will only absorb 50% of folate from food sources. So one thing to keep in mind, and I'll go into a bit more detail in the DRI slides, how they accommodate for that. All right, so here again is our folate. So remember those three components, the pteridine, the PABA, and then the glutamate. And remember, multiple glutamates can be attached, but this only occurs in the food form of folate. So folate, remember, that's the food, the one that's found naturally in food. It's the reduced form. So this is the one where you can attach up to 9 glutamates. So that's the polyglutamate form. And then why are you attaching glutamates? Does anyone remember? It's basically so it can be a better substrate, or it can kind of like stick onto its enzyme better, be like a better coenzyme once it's in its coenzyme form. So folic acid, on the other hand, remember that's the one that we find in supplements. It's the oxidized form. This one is only ever found in its monoglutamate form. So this one only ever has one glutamate attached. So I guess you can kind of see it as even being like won't stick onto enzymes as well. So it has, yeah, it's not as great of a substrate compared to the food one, because the food one you can attach all those glutamates, which makes it stick onto enzymes better. Whereas the one from supplements, you can only attach, it can only ever have one attached. So yeah, not as great of a substrate. So I'll walk you through the digestion for both the food source and then the supplement source. So remember folate, that's the food one, and that's the one that can have the multiple glutamates. So these little purple dots are basically just what I'm trying to show you as extra glutamates. And then that polyglutamate form of folate must be broken down into the monoglutamate form before it can be absorbed. So kind of similar to what we've seen before, you want to break these things down into its most basic. I guess it has to be in its like smallest form. You can kind of see it like that for it to get into the enterocyte. What cuts off all the glutamates is carboxypeptidase, which is just this enzyme that's usually just kind of sitting on the surface of the enterocyte that's always active. So carboxypeptidase comes along, cuts off all those extra glutamates. However, remember, one glutamate's always there because that's like one of the essential components. So if we go back, remember it's a pteridine, a PABA, and then this glutamate is always there. If you cut off that last glutamate, it's basically just not folate anymore. And then carboxypeptidase action is zinc dependent. We're going to learn about that in more detail in the zinc slides, but it is a zinc dependent enzyme. So if you actually have a zinc deficiency, then this can then also result in a folate deficiency because you can't cut off all these glutamates and then folate can't get into the enterocyte. So now looking at digestion of the supplement form, remember the supplement form or the folic acid form just has that one glutamate. This already happens to be the type of or the form of folic acid that the body wants. So then nothing really has to happen to it, and it can basically just enter just like that into the enterocyte. Absorption, nothing too complicated here, follows the same pathway. So if you're taking in kind of higher intakes of food or supplement sources of it, it will enter via passive diffusion. And then at low to normal intakes, it will be sodium dependent transport. So some type of transporter and energy will be used. In this case, the specific transporter is called FBP, or the folate binding protein. So it can absorb folate in its reduced or oxidized form. So it's used for both the supplement and the food form. And then they found that folate absorption is most efficient in the section of the intestine, the jejunum. So this is where it starts getting a little bit complicated. So remember, we haven't talked about what the coenzyme form of folate is yet. But just to clarify, the first time that folate actually starts to become its coenzyme form is actually in the enterocyte. So that's kind of interesting because usually, it gets passed through the enterocyte to the blood, to the liver, or to the tissues, and that's where the body kind of builds it up into this kind of active coenzyme form. Folate's a little different, so this process starts at the level of the enterocyte. So what happens, excuse me, is folic acid. So remember, what's that from? That's the supplement form. Folic acid first needs, if it comes in from the supplement form, first needs to be converted into folate. So converted into that reduced form. If you're getting it from foods, remember, you're already taking it in as folate. So that basically, if it's a food source, it'd just be coming in straight from here. So if it helps you, you could say like supplement form in here, food source in here. And then what happens once folate's kind of in this state, in the reduced form, 4 hydrogens are attached, which makes it THF. That stands for tetrahydrofolate. So very simply, you're adding 4 hydrogens on to make it tetrahydrofolate, and then you're adding, the last step is to add a methyl group on. So this is the main coenzyme form of folate, 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate. So it's a folate plus 4 hydrogens plus a methyl group, 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate. And remember, the glutamates really have nothing to do with it. They can be added on later on in the process, because remember, they were all like taken off. The body within tissues can add on extra glutamates to increase that kind of substrate availability, but the glutamates always confuse people. But just keep in mind, they have nothing to do with the coenzyme form. So once folate becomes its coenzyme form, 5-methyl-THF, that happens in the enterocyte. That compound then travels through the portal circulation. And remember, portal circulation is the circulation that goes directly to the liver. So it then travels like that. And it's actually attached to folate binding protein in the circulation. And then travels to the liver, where it can actually turn into other forms of other coenzyme forms. So I know this is like a little daunting. Don't worry, you don't need to memorize this whole thing. I'm just going to point out kind of the important parts to remember. So in the liver, remember, right now we're dealing with 5-methyl-THF. So the enterocyte made it into that basic coenzyme form. In the liver, it can be converted into the 2 additional coenzyme forms, which are 5-formino-THF and 5,10-methylene-THF. So these are the main other coenzyme forms that have kind of very specific functions in the body. And then that's done through basically the addition of like methyl groups or formal groups. But you don't even need to know exactly how they're made. Just know that 5-methyl-THF is the main coenzyme form. And then the 2 other important coenzyme forms are 5-methylene-THF and 5-formino-THF. At this stage in the liver, and then it also occurs in the tissues, you can attach other glutamates here. And then the glutamates, remember the polyglutamate form, you can attach up to 9 of them. Basically just makes folate a better substrate for the folate-dependent enzyme. So I always kind of see it as it can kind of like stick on to its enzyme more. Because remember, coenzymes basically are just attaching to enzymes and kind of helping them do whatever job they need to do. So attaching those glutamates just makes it like stickier almost. I guess you could kind of think of it like that. So storage of folate, 50% is actually found in the liver, and I think that's just because that's the main like distribution center that supplies all the different types of folate for different functions. And then the other half of it is really found kind of scattered throughout the body, primarily in the mitochondria and cytoplasm of cells. So main functions of folate, amino acid metabolism is definitely one of the main ones. And then the other thing that's super important is that it helps out with DNA synthesis and cell division. And that kind of plays a role in its major deficiency disorders like neural tube defects, and then also the anemia that we're going to go over. So that's it's involved in like purine and pyrimidine synthesis. And then that also ties into making red blood cells, which in that kind of chart I showed you where it's like the 2 major functions of B vitamins are remember, energy release, and then making red blood cells. So this is, finally we get to what I mean by that. So just to kind of step it back a bit and talk about how folate's involved in amino acid metabolism. So specifically what it's doing is it's involved in 1-carbon metabolism, which means that it's moving methyl groups around. Because remember, this is what methyl groups looks like, what a methyl group looks like. Methyl group is just CH3, so it's just 1 carbon basically attached to 3 hydrogens. That's what a methyl group is. And simply what the main thing that folate does is just move around these methyl groups. So it can accept or donate them. So one thing that it's involved in is one amino acid that it helps out with is histidine metabolism. And what happens here is folate helps with the deamination of histidine to form glutamate. So THF is accepting a formino group here, a 1-carbon group to form figlu, and then that results in the formation of glutamate. So it's helping to basically deaminate histidine to form glutamate. It's also involved in serine synthesis from lysine. So the specific one that's involved here is the 5,10 methylene THF. So remember how I showed you way back here the different forms? So this is that like 5,10 methylene form. And basically what's happening is 5,10 methylene THF is giving a hydroxymethylene group to glycine. And then basically, again, it's always a coenzyme. So the enzyme involved in that is serine hydroxymethyltransferase. And basically, you're just converting glycine into serine. And basically by donating that hydroxymethyl group. That's pretty much it. So most of these things, again, are just helping enzymes like move certain compounds around or electrons. That's pretty much what the B vitamins do. They kind of just move things around the body to keep metabolism chugging along. The main one that you'll probably remember, I know the other ones are kind of boring, but the one that you will probably remember as a major function of folate is its involvement in converting homocysteine to methionine. Have any of you ever heard of homocysteine? So what is homocysteine? Just ask yourself if you know what it is. Well, you probably know or you don't. But so homocysteine, first of all, just to say it like this, it's bad. So if you remember nothing else about it, just remember it's bad and it's related to higher heart disease levels, just to put that out there. So if you have higher circulating amounts of homocysteine, that does increase your risk of heart disease. And homocysteine is one of those things that's measured pretty routinely at all, like annual, if you go get annual checkups from your doctor, and if you look at your labs, you'll see homocysteine on there, and then you can see whether or not that's elevated or not. So that's, yeah, it's just a routine lab that they use to measure risk of heart disease. So if you do have higher circulating amounts, it does increase heart disease risk by a couple different mechanisms. They're still trying to figure out the details of all these, but they have found that it does. Homocysteine can impair endothelial function. It promotes the growth of smooth muscle cells and vascular lesions. It promotes platelet aggregation. And then they also found that if you take folate and B12 supplements, you can decrease homocysteine and heart disease risk. So there's this kind of inverse relationship there with the vitamins. So this is where it gets kind of complicated as well. I remember when I was taking this class, when I first saw this, I was like, oh no, what's going on here? I don't want to learn this. It looks so complicated. But let me just try to walk you through it step by step, so hopefully you can understand it. So here's what we were just talking about, homocysteine. So is homocysteine good or bad? It's bad. You want to get rid of it. It causes heart disease. So homocysteine is just present in the body no matter what, but you want to keep it under control. You want to make sure you have kind of lower levels of it. So the way that the body can kind of get rid of it or decrease levels of homocysteine is by converting it into methionine. So methionine is kind of like this benign compound that won't do anything. And then the way that you convert homocysteine, the bad thing, into the benign thing is simply by adding a methyl group. So here's what homocysteine looks like. Here's what methionine looks like. And if you look, it's basically just homocysteine with a methyl group attached onto it. And then if you remember, what does folate do? It transfers methyl groups around. So it's hopefully it's kind of coming together at this point. The major complicated thing and why this whole pathway looks so complicated is that folate wants to give homocysteine the methyl group, and once it gives it the methyl group, it then becomes methionine. Unfortunately, though, this enzyme that performs that transfer, that basically sticks that methyl group onto methionine, is B12 dependent. It's not folate dependent. So basically what happens is that here's folate, 5-methyl THF. So remember, this is the coenzyme form of folate. It has that methyl group on there to donate. Folate gives its methyl group to B12. B12 then donates it to this enzyme, homocysteine methyltransferase, then that methyl group is then donated to homocysteine so it can become methionine. So it's kind of like folate can't give its methyl group directly to this reaction. It has to like go through this middleman, which is B12. So whenever I'm teaching this in person, I kind of like show this like passing off reaction. So folate has this methyl group, it hands it off to B12, gives it to B12. B12, participates with this enzyme to basically hand homocysteine, or to basically attach the methyl group to homocysteine so it becomes methionine. So folate to B12, B12 to this conversion. So we can talk about this in the live Q&A session if it's confusing you. But basically, think about it as B12 being a middleman. Folate has to hand this methyl group off to homocysteine, attach it to homocysteine so it becomes methionine, but it can't do that directly. It has to do that through B12 first. So that's pretty much all that's happening. So again, yeah, we can discuss it more in person during the live Q&A if anyone is still a little confused. So another thing, another major thing other than kind of decreasing homocysteine and heart disease risk in the body, folate also functions, it has a major function in the replication of red blood cells. And it does this through the synthesis, through DNA synthesis. And then the coenzyme form for that one is 5-methylene THF. So it's not the 5-methyl one, it's 5-methylene THF. So one of the other ones we looked at in that whole liver pathway thing. And what 5-methylene THF, 5,10-methylene THF is doing is it's converting DUMP to DTMP. And DTMP is basically a nucleotide that's essential for DNA synthesis. And it basically makes folate essential for cell division, which is super important for red cells that have short lifespans. So it helps them just properly replicate. And then the enzyme involved in that is thymidylate synthase. So basically, this is the conversion if you're interested. But one thing that's super important is just remember folate is super important for cell division, for red cells, and this also plays a role in neural tube defects. So excretion basically just happens in the kidney, so in the urine. But first, folate is made into metabolites. So some of it can be excreted intact, but a lot of it's excreted as metabolites in the urine. In terms of DRIs, there is an RDA set for this. Kind of already mentioned it. If you remember, it's 400 for men and women, and that is micrograms per day. So just keep in mind we've now kind of shifted to micrograms per day. And the main reason that they set it at 400 was because this is what minimizes the chances of infant neural tube defects. It kind of helps pregnant women maintain their folate status. And they just notice, when people are taking in this amount per day, there's very low, it lowers the chances of neural tube defects greatly. Just to kind of touch on those dietary folate equivalents that I mentioned previously. So whenever the DRIs, folate DRIs are expressed as DFEs, dietary folate equivalents. And then remember, this is all related to basically the bioavailability or how much our body can absorb. So remember, from a supplement, you're getting like 100% of that. You take in a supplement, your body, depending on your body's capabilities, you can basically absorb up to 100% of the supplement form. But the food source form, so straight from a food, you can only absorb about 50% of it. For some reason, it's just not that bioavailable. So when you look at actual labels, like nutrition labels, they've already accounted for this by basically saying that one dietary folate equivalent is equivalent to 1 microgram of folate from food, which is 0.5 micrograms of folate from supplements. So just again, in relation to this. And that's all because folate in supplements is 2 times more bioavailable than the food form. All right, getting into deficiency. Neural tube defects, which I'm sure most of you have heard about before, but just in case you're unfamiliar with, the role of folate in this, which you may be, and just to kind of backtrack to, just in case you haven't taken any like reproductive physiology classes recently or ever, just to remind you that a neural tube defect is the failure of the neural tube to close. And it happens in about 1 in 1,000 births. It's probably the most common birth defect still today, from my understanding. And then what happened, it's a little scary because a lot of this has, well, hold on, let me just backtrack a bit. So the first thing that the baby really looks like, and this is like literally within the first couple weeks, like after kind of insemination, and I forget the first phase, I think it's called like the zygote phase. So you can almost see this, like, it kind of just turns into this like layer of cells that kind of looks almost like a tortilla. I know it's a little crass to say that, but this is the way I envisioned it when I was learning this. And yeah, you just have this like kind of flat circular layer of cells. And then the next thing that needs to happen in this first couple weeks is that kind of tortilla needs to kind of like fold over on itself. So literally this is like a flat layer, and then it kind of needs to like fold inwards on itself. And then this needs to get stitched up. So basically this is what the baby looks like. It doesn't at all obviously look like a baby in the first like month or so. It literally just looks like this kind of like flat thing of cells that's folded over. And this is also called the neural tube. It's basically the first thing of the baby that's made. And then this becomes the spine of the baby, and then one side of this becomes the brain. And it's super important that this gets stitched up, that this layer of cells gets stitched up. And folate plays a really important role in stitching this up through its the whole DUMP, DTMP thing that we talked about before, its role in cell division. And then if this is not stitched up, and say like there's a hole here because of improper stitching, that's what a neural tube defect is. And then that results in kind of major malformations of the brain and the spine. So again, if this is like the beginning thing, the neural tube, this is where basically there wasn't enough folate, so it couldn't stitch up that section of the neural tube. So it's literally like a big gaping hole. Or this is when there wasn't proper stitching up kind of at the top where the brain was, so then you have malformations of the brain as well. When babies are born, kind of like these two situations here, they usually, it's either like a miscarriage or the babies unfortunately die kind of right after being delivered. If it's kind of more minor, I think from my understanding, this is considered more of a minor case. The babies can survive, but a lot of times they're paralyzed, or they'll have to be in wheelchairs. They'll have like a lot of mobility issues for the rest of their lives. So it depends on how much the spine is actually affected. But yeah, in general, that's what neural tube defects actually look like clinically. So folate, they realized really quick, they realized in the past 100 years that folate was involved in decreasing neural tube defects or preventing them. And so again, that's all related to its DTMP, DUMP, all those functional slides. And it's mainly because it helps with cell division. And then they also found out that, taking 400 to 600 micrograms per day is what can prevent this. So what's currently recommended is still 400 micrograms per day throughout pregnancy. But now they're also saying that it might help to take 600 micrograms the 1 month before you become pregnant. Because a lot of women don't even realize that they're pregnant. Like, going back to this slide, this whole situation is happening in the first 21 to 28 days of gestation. So that's like literally a week after you kind of like miss your period type of situation. So, it's when you barely even realize you're pregnant, all of a sudden this super critical part of the baby's formation is happening. So that's why they're saying if you're planning on becoming pregnant, start taking folate before. And then definitely if you think you're pregnant, start taking it right away, because all these critical steps are happening at the very beginning. The first trimester is really, really important for just laying down the groundwork of a solid baby, basically, but like making sure everything's in its place and functioning properly. So that's what they recommend. A lot, if you look at kind of what the prenatals have, most of them have, I think, 4 to 600. I think 600, they just kind of like overshoot it a little bit just to make sure, just in case you like skip a dose or something here or there, just to make sure you have enough. And then I do have to say, remember I was saying that they started fortifying cereals and grains and stuff like that in the late 90s? That was actually very effective. So neural tube incidence went down by 35%, so which is great. Another deficiency disorder is anemia, so specifically megaloblastic macrocytic anemia. And that's kind of what happens in adults, so non pregnant adults. And what's happening there is the release of large immature red blood cells. So, this is what a normal red blood cell looks like, and this is what a megaloblastic macrocytic red blood cell looks like. So it's basically something that comes from the abnormal DNA synthesis. So basically, if there's not enough folate, it's not helping those red cells to divide properly. And when they don't divide, they just become these large, immature red blood cells that cannot, do their proper function. They just did not divide properly, and now they're inadequate. I guess you could kind of see it as that. But they can't do their function of carrying around oxygen. So the symptoms of this kind of typical with different types of anemia. So also remember, anemia doesn't mean iron deficiency. It literally just means like problem with the blood. I think that's what the like Latin, if you like trace it back. But so there's tons of different types of anemia. So this is one specific kind. I think the one we're so used to hearing is the iron deficiency anemia. But megaloblastic macrocytic is the one that relates to both folate and then also B12 deficiency, as you'll see in a second. So symptoms typical with, I guess, a lot of anemias, just because, it involves problems with transporting oxygen. So people feel tired, headaches, difficulty concentrating, because their tissues are not getting enough oxygen. Who's at risk? I'd say, very common, the things that we've seen before. So alcoholics, elderly as well, people with malabsorption disorders, and then also cancer patients taking methotrexate, because methotrexate prevents folate synthesis. The TUL is set at 1,000 micrograms per day. And the toxicity effect is kind of a little hard to understand too, but I'll try to walk you through it. So the main toxicity for folate is that it can mask B12 deficiency. And then if you're not getting enough B12, that can result in like some neuro problems as well. But what do you mean by folate masking B12 deficiency? How does folate do this? So if you have large amounts of folate coming in from the diet, so if you're taking in like a lot of supplements or a lot of grain products, the body doesn't need to rely on folate to be regenerated by B12. And I'll show you this on the next slide in basically that pathway I showed you before. So THF doesn't need to be regenerated into 5-methyl-THF. Instead, it can use the extra folate from the diet to kind of go on and produce DNA, like help in cell division, etc., which would then also prevent macrocytic anemia. So let me just show you this more in like picture format. So remember, there's this whole thing of the methyl group being passed from the coenzyme of folate to B12 to then go on and transfer or to make homocysteine into methionine. So this is kind of this whole, like, there's this pathway. So methyl is donated to B12. B12 gives it over here. So it's these kind of like cyclical pathways. You can kind of see it like that. However, when the coenzyme form of folate, so 5-methyl-THF, gets rid or donates its methyl group, it then becomes just straight up THF, because obviously, it's just folate plus 4 hydrogens plus a methyl group. So when it's kind of participating in this reaction with B12, donating methyl to B12, B12 is actually recycling it. So when you have basically large amounts of diet, so you need B12 to kind of help recycle it if you're getting like just minimal or normal quantities of folate. However, with large amounts of dietary folate coming into the body, you don't need to rely on B12 to do this whole recycling. You basically can just have this constant supply coming in. and then it can just help out in this reaction. So basically that's what this whole like folate can mask B12 deficiency is. All right, so moving on to B12 now. This is kind of the shorter part of the lecture. It's a bit more straightforward of a vitamin. So cobalamin is the name for B12, if you didn't know that before. It's a term for a group of compounds called the coronoids. And it's called that because each of them have this coron nucleus, which have these 4 pyrrole rings. And then in the center of this ring structure is an atom of cobalt. So basically, this is what, it's pretty complicated looking. This is what B12 looks like. Maybe it took them this long to find it because it's a pretty complicated looking compound. And so when you have this structure here, you can attach a whole bunch of different things to that cobalt. You can attach like cyanide, a hydroxyl group, water, etc. However, it's only considered the coenzyme form of B12 when you add a methyl group to it. So these are just other things that can attach, but this is B12. And then in order to make it into its coenzyme form, you attach this methyl group to this cobalt. So you mainly just need to pay attention to this. The coenzyme form is basically B12 cobalamin with a CH3 with a methyl group attached. Food sources, it's kind of, B12 is kind of interesting. You basically only get it from animal sources kind of naturally. I forgot to mention, so the RDA is 2.4 for men and 2.4 for women. And again, this is in micrograms, so we need much smaller amounts of this. So the key food source I'd really say is meat. So yeah, it doesn't follow the whole meats and grains thing really, if you're talking about the actual like naturally occurring sources. And the reason we get it from animal products or meats in particular is because B12 is produced by microorganisms. So when you're getting it from an animal source or from a meat, you're really just getting it from a contamination of microorganisms on the surface of like that muscle or that piece of meat that you're about to eat. So it's kind of literally B12 is just derived from microorganism contamination. And then it's kind of gross, but the same thing happens. If you do ever get it from a plant source, it's not like you're getting it from the plant itself. You're getting it from microorganism contamination. So in this case, it would more likely be manure. So a good example of this is like when you have mushrooms, you know how there's like little flecks of dirt and stuff on mushrooms when you first buy it. And then, obviously the first thing you want to do is wash that off. Well, you're actually washing away all the B12. If you were to consume all that dirt and manure, I guess, on the mushrooms, that's actually like chock full of B12. So that's the only time you'd really be getting B12 naturally from a food source. So then there's a lot of questions. Well, if you're only really getting it naturally from animal products, what happens with vegetarians and vegans? Can they get enough B12? In this day and age, absolutely. B12 is super, there's lots of things that are fortified with B12. It's very, very prevalent. So, fortified, there's cereals and grains, and then that's fortified up to 75% for a lot of those products, kind of similar to folate. So just with one serving, you can get like, 3/4 of your B12 needs with just one serving of grain products. It's also found in a lot of the fortified milks, so soy milk, almond milk, oat milks, that type of thing. A lot of them, depending, really depends on the brand, but I noticed that most of them do add B12. And then, fruits and vegetables contaminated with manure too. That's another key food source. So that's ways, but I would not say, for vegans that do eat any of these types of products, like fortified products, they should be totally fine. So digestion of B12 is different from digestion and absorption is different compared to all the other B vitamins, basically. So remember that it would always follow that same pattern of like high intakes, passive diffusion, low intakes, energy dependent process. B12 is different in that it's something that can be very easily degraded by microorganisms. So the body, instead of having that kind of more simple absorption pathway, has to constantly have it attached to special proteins in the stomach and in the intestine, and then those proteins protect it from degradation by those microorganisms. So let me just walk you through this. The first thing that happens is B12 in a food is usually attached to some type of protein. So the very first thing that happens is that protein that's attached to B12 in the food has to be cut off. And then, so the things that are cutting off the protein from B12, the food protein, is pepsin or HCl. So it's basically attached to a protein, it's cut off from that. Then it enters the stomach, and then the body knows, I guess, somehow that B12 is can be degraded really, really quickly by bacteria. So then the body kind of immediately attaches another protein to it, and specifically it attaches something called an R protein. This is released by saliva and the stomach. The R proteins kind of immediately bind onto the B12 right after it's released from that food protein. So R proteins are also called haptocorins, and they have a high affinity for B12, and it basically protects B12 from being degraded by bacteria. Then the B12 moves down the GI tract, so it goes into the duodenum. Once it enters the duodenum, it's cut off from the R protein by pancreatic enzymes. Free B12 is released, just very briefly. And then right away almost, another type of protein is attached called intrinsic factor. So intrinsic factor is a glycoprotein synthesized by gastric cells. And then this complex, this new complex of the intrinsic factor, or IF, plus B12, is they attach to each other, and then they kind of float down the intestine until it's eventually absorbed intact. So the B12 IF is absorbed together, and then those are only broken apart once they're in the enterocyte. So problems that occur, let me just summarize here. So the main way, even though again this looks pretty complicated, just remember B12 always has to be attached to a protein, or else bacteria will kind of jump on it and degrade it immediately. So the body attaches it to R protein in the stomach pretty much, and then switches it out in the intestine, and then attaches it to intrinsic factor when it's traveling through the intestine. So R protein in the stomach, intrinsic factor in the intestine. That's I just gave you like a long, complicated thing, but that's, if you kind of just whittle it down, that's basically what's happening here. And then just remember that in order to be absorbed, it's still attached to intrinsic factor, and then it gets broken off of that in the enterocyte. And then if you kind of think about this is a pretty complicated pathway for absorption. So a lot of people, particularly the elderly, have problems absorbing B12. And that's because, they need to have adequate amounts of R protein and intrinsic factor being made, and a lot of them don't. As you get older, your body's processes, like everything just kind of slows down. So a lot of times elderly are not getting enough B12 just because their body isn't making enough R protein or intrinsic factor. There's a whole bunch of different things, as we talked about with the elderly, with food availability, etc. But that's kind of the main thing. Just remember B12, it's pretty complicated to absorb it, and you need those things there to protect it. And sometimes people just don't make enough. So absorption generally is between 11 to 65% for most people. Most people aren't absorbing like 100% of B12. The good news about B12, though, is that we can actually store it for a really long time. So B12 you can store, it's the only one that you can store for years. You can actually, some people can store it for up to 30 years, they found out. And it's about 2 to 4 milligrams of B12 that are stored in the body. So quite a bit, considering that, we need micrograms of intake. And so when you take it into tissues, your body does need this TC receptor. So that's transcobalamin 2 receptor to basically take it in. It is found all throughout the body, but it is in high amounts in liver, muscle, bone, kidney, heart, and brain. So just one really important thing here is that B12 is basically the only water-soluble vitamin that is stored for a long time. All the other ones, you develop a deficiency after a certain amount of months of not having it. But B12, if you do have sufficient stores, you can go without it for a pretty long time. So what's the function of B12? Well, luckily it's basically what we already talked about. So if you understood the folate slides, which again, if you didn't, we'll talk about it during the live session. But that whole conversion of homocysteine to methionine, where B12, takes the methyl group from folate and then donates it to homocysteine so it can become methionine. That's it. This whole thing is the main function of B12 that we know. So again, folate has this methyl group, can't give it directly to homocysteine, passes it to B12, and then B12 then passes it over to homocysteine, so it becomes methionine. Oh, my battery is low. I just have to plug in my computer, sorry. And then DRIs, excuse me, we talked about it, 2.4 for both men and women. And again, micrograms per day. This is an RDA. And then they have noticed, as I talked about before with absorption, it does, it's pretty prevalent in the elderly, but absorption does start to kind of sharply decrease in someone's early 50s. That's when they notice that people are having problems making that intrinsic factor and then the R protein. And so incidence in the elderly, like people in their 60s and 70s, it's usually about 15% of the elderly have pretty low levels of B12. And that can be corrected with fortified foods, but most often what they do is they kind of inject pretty large doses. So we'll talk about that in a couple slides. Deficiency of B12 is megaloblastic macrocytic anemia. So it's the same as for folate. It's just because the metabolism of folate and B12 are so interconnected. So remember, that's those kind of large, bloated, immature red blood cells that can't do their jobs because they haven't divided properly. The other thing that happens with B12 is not only do you get this anemia, but you also get a bit of neuropathy with it. So memory loss and dementia have also been shown to occur with B12, and they're not quite sure how, why that's happening, but that's another clinical sign of B12 deficiency. So anemia, neuropathy, and then what happens really with both low folate and low B12 levels is you can increase your heart disease risk. And that's because, you don't have enough folate and B12 to convert the kind of bad homocysteine into the benign methionine. So then you have increased circulating amounts of homocysteine in your blood. And then that can obviously increase your heart disease risk. But just to also point out that deficiency generally results from poor absorption, not poor intake. So because B12 is so heavily fortified now, people are usually actually getting enough. If the elderly are not eating enough, sure, that might be a problem, but it's just absorption is the main thing. It's got a complicated absorption pathway. Everything has to be there for it to be properly absorbed. So that's the main reason that people over the age of 50 are not getting enough of it in their systems. Poor absorption, not poor intake. Toxicity, actually, interestingly, it's not established. People can take very high amounts of this, actually, intravenously and be fine. If you have someone who's deficient, sometimes they try to give oral doses at first, but a lot of people know that, absorption is kind of shut down or slowed down. So a lot of times they'll just do injections. So they do 500 to 1,000 micrograms per day. Since I had Crohn's disease, I had to do this. I think it was once a week, and it was 1,000 once a week for a month or so. And that definitely helped boost my B12 levels. And then nasal sprays are also popular. That just bypasses the GI tract as well. I don't know, it seems a little uncomfortable for me. I'm not sure exactly how that feels. But there are, interestingly, with even these super high doses, there's no, because remember, all we need is 2.4 per day. And you're giving basically 500 times that. So there's no clear toxicity symptoms with these massive B12 doses. In fact, I saw it in the mall. I noticed I was in a mall a couple of years ago, and there was a B12 center set up where you could just get injections if you wanted to without a prescription. I don't know. It was all the rage a few years ago to just up your B12 levels. I haven't seen that in the past year or so, but who knows? I'm not sure what that was about. But I guess people just got really obsessed with B12 for some reason. Probably energy levels or something like that. All right, so just really quickly to kind of finish up here, what are the two major functions of B vitamins? energy release, and formation of blood cell components. So we just talked about that one today. And so now you know that they basically folate in particular helps red cells to divide and just kind of making healthy red blood cells that can do its job. And that's that. All right, great. Well, I'm happy to follow up during the live Q&A if you guys have any questions. I know we covered a lot of kind of complicated concepts in this lecture. So yeah, I will see you then. Thanks a lot.